My name is Laura Burocco. I'm a researcher at the Center for Research in Anthropology, CRIA, in Lisbon. Translation is central to the aim and conception of my entire research project between Brazil and South Africa. And I think that when we talk about the colonial practices in academia and knowledge production, the issue of language deserves to be considered more closely. I'm here referring, for example, to multilingual editorial boards for publication and the provision of free translation from a source's language other than English, or simply the translation at seminars. I will briefly present the South-North dialogue on Afro-Indigenous art project and how our today dialogue is organized. So the idea of the project came out from attending Abaquad during the opening week of the past Art Venice Bienal. Abaquad is a gathering of indigenous artists and curators founded in 2018 by Vanda Nandibush, who is an indigenous curator at the Art Gallery of Ontario in Canada. Its 2022 edition was organized in partnership with the Semi Pavilion, which was the first pavilion designated as an indigenous one in the history of the Venice Bienal. So during Abaquad, during the 4 days program of Abaquad, the conversation and presentation were very deep and rich, but there were few indigenous voices from Latin America, and language again was the issue. So I started thinking about how to relate my research on indigenous art in Brazil to the stories and practices that I came across in Venice during that week. So thanks to the support of the Italian Council, I was able to travel to Norway and Sweden last year in November, where I visited the Alta Museum archive that brings together historical materials of the semi-indigenous struggle from the 80s. I met one of the curators of the Semi-Pavilion, Katia Garcia-Anton, and visit the Semi-Contemporary Center for Art in Karasjok. So starting from the engagement with the Brazilian side, the main aim of the project is very simple, is to provide a space of encounter where spontaneous dialogue and sharing between indigenous artists and curators and academics from Brazil and SEPMI can happen. So the speakers are invited to bring into the conversation observation, questions, doubts, concern, and achievements that they consider relevant to discuss together in relation to their practices, their experiences, circulation in different biennials and artistic events, and in a broader sense, their living spaces, which is often central to their creative processes. So we will share some answer reflection about what is art from a non-Western perspective, what is art made for, what does it mean to curate, what exactly we curate, what kind of relationship do they want, if they want to establish with the official art words in bracket. And after this brainstorming by each of the participants, we will open a conversation between them first, and then we open to the public. So I'm going to stop here and give the floor to our speaker, and also want to thank the audience for their interest and for joining us.
So as I mentioned, I had the pleasure of curating the Luleå Art Biennial in 2020, and I did this together with my co-curator Christina Zetterlund. Christina is a brilliant design and craft curator from Sweden. We are both from the south of Sweden. Christina from Småland and Stockholm, and myself from Gothenburg. As I mentioned, we had about 18 months, 2 years to work on the biennial, which is called Luleå Biennial, but essentially it's situated within the Norrbotten region, which is a kind of really large region within the north of Sweden. And to give you a kind of sense of the kind of scale of it, it's not necessarily a city biennial. It's a biennial that covers a region. And so you could have different venues that are up to 300, 400 kilometers apart. So it's a very different condition to a kind of a city-based kind of biennial. And this year we were asked to work on the biennial to also introduce craft into the biennial, given that Norrbotten is a very rich area that kind of engages through various forms of craft practices historically. And so from the onset, when we were invited, because part of that is our background too. So I work as a design professor at Gothenburg University, and Christina is a design and craft historian. And we, when we were invited to work with craft too, we really wanted to kind of situate craft in a kind of broader composition. So not so kind of interested in the kind of formal kind of conventions around what craft is, especially kind of gallery related craft, but really thinking about the kind of everyday craft. So craft of kind of food making, the kind of craft around car modifications, craft around kind of really hobbyist practices like straw craft, weaving, kind of traditional wood carving, jewelry making, but also very much in relationship to the kind of Sami craft of duji. Within the biennial, we were asked to work with it as a craft and art biennial, and in no way were we interested in the relationship between craft and art. It wasn't a biennial that was putting the two in relation to each other. And so it was very much about kind of introducing craft into a different kind of dialogue within a very specific region, kind of formatted through a biennial. When we were invited to do the biennial, we were invited on the premise to make a proposal, and the first thing that we decided to do was not actually make a proposal with an overarching theme. And that was partly to acknowledge that both Christina and myself are not from Norrbotten, the region, and it would be difficult to impose a biennial theme as a frame to think through within that region. And so our kind of initial idea was to think with Norrbotten through what we described as listening and learning. And this meant spending much of our time there and kind of listening to what we described as listening wildly. And this was firstly to understand the cultural networks within the region, and secondly, through the kind of engagement of listening with different kind of people, participants, organizations within the Norrbotten region, to allow questions of concern to emerge from that. To do that, to focus our ears and kind of find a direction for listening, we formulated 4 principles for the development of the biennial. And the principles helped steer us into different directions, allowed us, again, going back to what Laura is speaking about, to allowed us a kind of common language to share, and at times were helpful reminders for us as curators on how to act within this specific region. And so the first principle that we started to work with was beyond border thinking. And this was to think beyond established boundaries between craft and arts, and so to go beyond sharp divisions between practices, people, traditions, and places. And one of the things that we were really keen on here to do was also to kind of go beyond the dominant north-south axis within Sweden, and to really think about the kind of east-west, west-east axis that the Norrbotten region acts within, especially in relationship to the Sami community. And then the second principle was decentering, which was to generate dialogues with places and people on their own terms, and to avoid viewing things through what we described as premeditated hierarchies or value standards. And here to kind of really try to find practices of listening carefully and learning, and very much not trying to impose through a curatorial lens. And then the third principle was something we call custodianship. And this was to work with the overall ecology of the biennial, making the biennial with an awareness of how to manage its resources and taking care of it as a resource for future guests and hosts. So recognizing our roles as curators as essentially as kind of very much engaging with the history of the biennial, but also as a kind of future making activity, allowing for other for the future of the biennial to be kind of considered. And here we also wanted to recognize that the art biennial format can be extractive in its very own nature. And so where possible, finding ways to avoid and limit the kind of extractive nature of the biennial. And then the final principle that we worked with was called earthed imagination. And this was about focusing on identifying practices that shift imagination from the individual to the collective. Really importantly, thinking about how the biennial can kind of support modalities of being collective, but also the kind of languages. And here we foregrounded a collective imagination that starts from the earth and where places, and the places where people gather and find themselves. And so really here kind of trying to kind of consider the biennial as a framework for this kind of collective thinking and imagination. And importantly, these principal actors as a kind of form of kind of biennial commoning. So they were not just principles for us, but also principles that we put into kind of activation and circulation. And the next thing with through the listening and learning was, as I mentioned, allowing kind of questions of concern to emerge. So kind of really combining local urgencies with these kind of notions of global questions. And through that, we slowly began to gather 3 threads that we started to work with in the biennial. And the first thread that we wanted to kind of work with in the biennial was ice and snow. So recognizing that climate change is a material and social reality within Norrbotten, and it's something that's there very present. It's not an abstract thing, it's very kind of material. And so ice and snow acts as earth evidence to kind of climate change. And what would it mean to look at climate change through this kind of register, through the kind of material engagement? And then the second thread that we were working on was extractivism, and here to really address the kind of circular histories of extractivism within the region, and to pay close attention to the local, national and global mechanisms to these ongoing processes of extraction within the area, and extraction on many different levels and scales. And then the third and final thread that we're working with is was called Crafting Beyond the Wastelands. And this was to locate counter-narratives and counter-practices against the depiction of Norrbotten as a wasteland. So there is a historical kind of trope, a colonial trope, let's describe it, even an internal one, that has in many ways depicted and depicts Norrbotten as empty, as a wasteland to be extracted from. And so here we wanted to kind of really think about how local practices, especially within the broader field of craft, have always formed a kind of counter narrative to this depiction. And then finally, I will just talk about the 3 formats that we worked through. And the first was around how a biennial can act. And then this brought in something, okay, how do we work outside of the dominant form of the exhibition? So we introduced the festival to the biennial, working across the geography of Norrbotten and not necessarily having to do things through the exhibition format. And then we set up something called the learning room. Again, this was a kind of format that allowed us to listen widely and to put different practices into place by, again, not really necessarily having to work through the exhibitions. And then finally was an exhibitions format. I realized that I've shown all this images, kind of spoken about the biennial, but I haven't shown any kind of visual images. So here are just a very few kind of quick images for that. But I think I've taken my time now, so I will escape out of that.
Hello, thank you for invitation to be with you today. You might notice that I'm currently on the road coming back from Yokmok, where we had study trip with the students, studying curators, and my main place where I'm based is Karasjok. I work as a director of a Summit Center for Contemporary Art. We are working at Summit Center for Contemporary Art quite broadly. We are organizing exhibitions, as well realizing educational programs for young people. And also, we are currently developing educational program for Sami curators with focus of curating from indigenous perspective. So that is a very broad spectrum. We are art institution. We as well produce quite large research output as peer-reviewed articles, as well as contribution to various conferences. So the first image which you see is actually the garden of Summit Center for Contemporary Art. And here you can see one of the examples of performance workshops which we have developed for young people between 12 and 16 years old as the tool to explore the artworks. You might see the sculpture just behind this group of children. And in this case, they would interpret the artwork by the movements. This is the example of educational program for youth. Here you can see the example of exhibition which we are having as the program of the last year. The exhibition was titled Treasure Chest and was based on the collection of Sami arts from Ridu Daughter Museum. The museum is as well located in Karasjok. In this photo, you can see a bit similarly as in the photo before that the method of communication of the artworks is performative interpretation, performative translation. So for us as the Art Center, it is very important to discover and explore, or explore and discover as the cyclic process. How we can invite our audiences in a different way. How the visit to our art center can transgress the traditional format of spectatorship and be more of the embodied experience, what the audience members would remember not only through their one sense of seeing, but with multiplicity of senses. And as I have mentioned to you, the importance for us on the meeting point between art and research, some of our exhibitions are very explicitly connected to this. By being the exhibitions which are visual outcome of research process. So in this image, you can see the visual outcome of a longitudinal research project by Professor Gunvor Guttorm from Sami University of Applied Sciences. After several years of research, her, together with her research assistants, Laila Susanna Kumonen and Berit Christina Gufsom, they were three artists who showed the visual outcome of this research process in one of our exhibition halls. And after this exhibition, we, together with principal investigator Professor Gunvor Guttorm, presented the outcome at the conference Society for Artistic Research. And as the third step, we are developing now peer-reviewed book chapter. So all these steps are very important for us as the Art Center. And just to summarize a bit how we communicate artworks, how are we as the Art Center in Karasjok, in the very north of Norway? So our audiences are different, local audiences as well as tourists. So local audiences as well as the audiences coming from global contexts. Therefore, when we are preparing our exhibitions, we are thinking about multi-perspective of audiences. We are also thinking how to make research accessible to the audiences. As the example on the previous slide, to explain research to the audiences, we show the process samples. We show step by step within longitudinal study process of those developing the research. So we aim to unfold and to explain. For us, it's very important to have explorative way of providing experience to the audiences, involve performance and multisensory reading of the exhibitions of the artworks. And to say it even more explicitly, we are involving movement and choreography as the way to translate the artworks in different ways. So when we are having groups of children or groups of young people, we invite them to move together in the space to see if the artwork can speak in the embodied way. Of a great importance when we say artwork and the viewer and meeting point between these two. Thank you very much. That was my presentation.
Good morning, and I want to thank the invitation to be able to share my initiatives and practices
com a arte no Brasil.
with art in Brazil.
Eu fico parando, isso que eu falando devagar e tá.
No, I'm going to speak slowly and
Para tentar
fast
entender a dinâmica melhor.
so we can understand the dynamic.
Eu sou Moara.
My name is Moara.
Tupinambá.
Tupinambá.
Sou ali da região do Pará, da
I'm
Amazônia.
from the region of Pará, of the
Tenho
Amazon.
minha família ali de Santarém, Baixo Amazonas.
My family is from
No
Santarém,
Tapajós.
which is lower Amazon.
Atualmente eu sou artista visual.
I'm actually a visual artist.
Tenho trabalhado com curadorias,
But
que eu
also
chamo de curadorias ativistas,
but also called
pelo
it
fato de que acho muito importante a atuação de nós, enquanto artistas, que temos
It's also very important for
acesso
as artists
a pouco mais, né, dessa cultura ocidental na cidade e
who have
desse
access
sistema
to
das artes.
system of arts
Que é
within the city
vital
and
importância
of Western
nós também
system of art.
tentarmos de alguma maneira atuarmos em curadorias.
So it's also important to act as a
E geralmente
curator.
as curadorias que trabalho são coletivas.
They're also normally collective
geralmente
curatorship.
com outros, né, curadores.
Also meetings of curators.
Tá tudo bem? E eu fiquei pensando o que trazer para cá, para essa
And I've been thinking about what to bring here to the
conversa.
conversation.
Diante de tanta coisa que eu faço.
with all of this kind of work that
não
I've
só
been
como
doing,
artista, mas como ativista.
not just as an artist, but also as an
E
artist. And we were invited to do a curatorship that was
muito
a lot of work.
energia.
And the focus was the Amazon,
Vou falando,
this
vou.
very
O recorte era a
Amazon.
Amazônia.
And this exhibition
Para a gente era muito
happened in São Paulo.
importante
And for us, it was very important
para que houvesse a exposição desses artesanatos,
that the exhibition of
esses
the
coletivos,
craftsmen and women, of this artisans,
artesãos, também tivessem um acompanhamento
had an
seu processo
accompaniment
criativo,
in its collected
para que eles também
process,
entendessem o que é uma exposição, né? E o nosso
so they
maior
could also
desafio
understand what an exhibition
como
was.
fazer uma exposição de artesanatos contemporânea dos
And that goes
artesãos,
beyond a
fazer
notion
dos
of
artesãos.
a contemporary vision of this.
E
So,
o que eles têm trazido em relação à inovação
and what they have brought
também
in
na
terms of
questão
innovation
do
in their
artesanato.
artistic work. Something that I pinpointed
Era
as very important,
enfatizar,
and I wanted to
trazer,
emphasize and bring,
valorizar
is to
a
bring
questão
value to the
do
question
processo
of the process,
criativo
the creative
da
process,
construção do artesanato.
of the construction of
Por quê?
artisanship and craftsmanship.
Porque existe uma desvalorização muito grande,
Why? Because there's a
No Brasil.
disvaluing of
inclusive,
this in Brazil
em questão de políticas públicas
in terms of
para a questão do artesanato, da criação.
public politics in terms of this.
Então, não
politics.
existe um distanciamento do
So there's a
consumidor
distance
final, do
of the person
colecionador final,
buys
nem
or collects
colecionador que até entende
the
um
work,
pouco, mas
and the
consumidor final
artisan.
sobre o que é fazer um
And there's a
artesanato.
distance from what it means to make
Na questão do
great work.
tempo,
The time it takes,
na questão do que está por trás, a
what's
história
behind the process and the history of
da
the work,
feitura de um artesanato,
creating an artisan,
a questão do que conta uma história milenar
and what it means to be
dessas
part of a millennial
populações que já
story,
fazem há muito tempo.
which are works that are
esse
being made
saber, né?
over long periods of time.
Então, isso foi um ponto que a gente foi crucial,
So this is a
e que a
crucial
gente
point
trouxe
for us
também para a nossa exposição
that we brought into the
que
exhibition.
aconteceu em São Paulo.
It happened in São
Eu vou
Paulo.
mostrar aqui para vocês,
I'm going to show some of
ficar
the works here,
mais fácil de
so
visualizar.
that we can visualize some of the work.
É,
We thought it was very important
facilitadores.
to also bring in
Esses
facilitators.
facilitadores, a maioria designers,
And these
criativos,
facilitators were mostly
artistas,
designers, artists,
2 artistas indígenas.
2 indigenous
E,
artists.
infelizmente, a gente ainda tem um quadro muito pequeno para que acompanhasse esses coletivos.
We still have a
E
small
trouxemos, né,
possibility of accompaniment of these
e
collectives.
fizemos questão de colocar também como artesão o protagonista.
And we made
o
sure to put
artista
the artisan
dessa
as the protagonist of this
Infelizmente,
exhibition,
durante muito tempo, por uma visão colonialista, os designs
which
acabam indo
unfortunately has been
para as
considered
comunidades e o
over a long
design
period of time
assina o
for-
artesanato e o nome do design que fica em voga.
So for a long period of time, because of colonial practices,
Dessa vez,
the
nós enfatizamos de colocar
was-
o nome de todos os
had less importance
artesãos
in who signed the
para
artifact and would be
valorizar
the
as
designer,
subjetividades
ship-
e autoria.
and to focus on
Então,
authorship
estão
of
todos os nomes deles
the-
aqui.
who the
né?
artist is
Vocês
behind the
podem
work.
ver.
and where the artist is coming
E aqui
from.
no site vocês podem encontrar um pouquinho mais,
And we can see on the site more information
e ver
about
um pouco do que foi
the
a
exhibition.
exposição em si. Né? O que estava por trás do objeto, né? A
What was
alma do
behind
objeto foi
the
o que
object.
nós tentamos trazer
We were trying to
para
bring
essa
behind
exposição.
the object, the
E
process
isso
behind the object.
envolvia fotografia do processo criativo,
And this involved
como que faziam
photos of the
no
process,
tempo, vídeos do processo criativo,
videos
tudo
of the process, of
para
the
a nossa
creative
exposição,
process
para
for our
que o
exhibition,
público sentisse o que é
so that the
essa
public
arte.
creators could
milenar.
understand and feel what it is this artistic process and what is this
E
art,
aqui
millennial
também
art.
temos deixa eu só ver aqui um momentinho. Também temos um tour virtual. Aqui vocês podem acompanhar cada
A
projeto.
virtual accompaniment of
De
each
associações Dia de Manaus, aqui das mulheres do Alto Rio Negro,
of
do
artists,
Artesanato Rio Grande,
females
Centro
from
Cultural
Manaus,
Cadiré, os Craô,
cultural center in Cajau,
os Craô, lá de Tocantins,
from Tocantins, from
Cistaria
the part of
Vanilla,
Brazil,
Cistarias Tapajônicos, Ceramistas Tapajônicos,
from
Doutor
the
da Borracha,
Tapajós.
Nova Arte e Militombes. E aqui vocês podem também, posso passar depois aqui,
Here you can
fazer
also
um tour
see
virtual.
You can do a virtual tour
exposição.
of the exhibition,
E
of the different artists.
algo que enfatizamos muito é tentar entender a alma do que está por trás de
Something
cada
that we
objeto
emphasize
criado.
is what
No
the
caso aqui,
spirit behind the piece
esse
of work.
é o meu preferido. Gosto de todos, mas
This is
um que
one
eu
of my
gostei
favorite
muito, que
pieces.
foi Miritong, um coletivo
Estonia, a
lá
collective
de Abaetetuba,
from
no
Abaetetuba
Pará,
in Pará.
fazem objetos de Miriti para um festival, para uma procissão que acontece
Create objects for
ao Círio
procession.
de Nazaré. Então, eles fazem brinquedos para vender em outubro
Dia de
para a Igreja
Nazaré,
Católica.
this procession, this
E o
Catholic
que eu
procession that
provoquei
occurs.
aqui, os artistas do Miritong, era entender o que estava por trás de cada
And what we
criação,
want to do
como que
is
eles poderiam
share what's
valorizar
behind each of these
as cosmovisões locais. E
these are
devido ao
objects
apagamento,
that we could look into
até
the
mesmo
local
da origem
cosmovision.
indígena deles ali, eles se colocam em lugares que chamamos de ribeirinhos, né? Que eles se chamam de
And these
ribeirinhos.
are living
Interessante que
in
os artistas
areas that are called
começaram a
ribeirinhos,
associar
which
essa
are by the
história,
rivers,
essa
on the
memória,
coast of the rivers.
trouxeram as encantarias. Ficava falando, parece uma madeira, mas
It looks
é
like
uma fibra do
wood, but
buriti,
actually it's a fiber
que eles
that's used
utilizam lá para a economia local,
for their local
para que
economies
consigam, de fato,
and for these pieces as well.
mostrar um pouco da cultura.
So
E aí,
to
na
share
exposição,
some of
vocês poderiam encontrar você pode olhar, né, aqui depois.
you can find the information and all
Foi
the,
feito no
all this
Centro Cultural São
in the virtual
Paulo.
exhibition, which
Foi
happened
muito
in the
interessante
Cultural Center in São Paulo.
que os próprios artistas puderam participar,
And it was very
estavam lá,
important for the
e eles
local
mesmos
artists
também
to
podiam
participate
ter
and
contato
be there
direto com o
present with
público.
us.
Então, o público podia conversar com artistas, com os
The public and the
artesãos.
spectators could also have
Ele
a
tinha um vídeo
with
contando
the
também
artist,
sobre os
have a
processos
conversation with
criativos
the
de
artist,
cada
which is very
um.
important.
Então, você podia entender como é que foi construída, né,
So then you could
cada
also see how the
trabalho.
works were constructed,
E
process of the.
um pouco do que eu poderia mostrar para vocês aqui. A gente teve todo esse cuidado
Bit of what I can
de
show you.
mostrar um pouquinho
We took care with this.
sobre
We wanted to be careful
o que está por trás, né, de cada...
to share what was
Tudo isso
behind
construído por elas. A gente só traduzia
all that's constructed by
e
these
colocava aqui na
collective
própria
of female
exposição,
artists.
né?
And we were
E
just
aí foi
bringing
uma exposição festival. Teve
And we
também
also created a
cursos,
festival
oficinas, que
with
elas mesmas podiam
workshops and
fazer e oferecer ao público lá.
classes.
E
that,
eu senti de trazer isso
public
aqui para vocês,
Pardon.
para falar um pouquinho. Não sei se meu tempo já terminou, Laura.
So I brought some of this
Já.
work to be able to share with you.
Não? Não estou sem te ouvir. E aí vocês podem olhar um pouquinho mais, entender, né? Nós tivemos várias oficinas, seminários.
And here you
Foi
can
muito
find more information about the
interessante.
seminars, about the workshops that were happening there on the virtual,
A presença dos artesãos.
the
E
presence
como
of
que
the
eles também puderam construir
artisans
artesanato também com inovação, né? Com
And how they
outras
were able to
ideias que
construct the
nunca tinham
artisan
feito na própria
work
comunidade.
with their
Isso foi
innovation
interessante, né? Isso
of the
foi
local
uma
communities that
provocação
they're part of. So this is kind of a
interessante para
provocation
os próprios artistas.
that was important for the artists. The question of
Entender
innovation.
também, por exemplo, o que está por trás dessas sementes, o
And
tempo
to
de
understand
produção de uma
what's
tinta,
behind
que é
the materials that they're working with, times it
que
takes
os
to
caô fazem
create the works they're
manualmente,
making,
e que isso demora um tempo, né,
And the time
muito
it
grande
takes
para fazer, de doer a
create
mão,
pieces.
de machucar,
how it affects their
de
hands
fazer a joia,
manually,
essa biojoia.
and
Bravo.
how they create these.
Tivemos lá também.
Obrigado, Laura. Obrigado, Laura.
Thank you, Laura.
Obrigada a você.
Bom, temos um tempo corrido aqui. Eu vou compartilhar a minha tela.
I'm going to share my screen as well.
Pronto. Vocês conseguem ver, né?
Are you able to see? Yes.
Ok. Enfim, eu tenho trabalhado com algum tipo de repertório para criar
I worked with a repertoire to
uma
create
presença de artistas indígenas no Brasil.
a
Acho
presence
que, ao
of
contrário de
indigenous
outros
artists in
lugares
Brazil,
do mundo,
which may be different from
como
other parts of the
Austrália,
world,
Canadá,
like Australia or Canada.
na própria América Latina,
In Latin America,
Peru,
in Peru,
Colômbia,
In Colombia,
a presença de artistas indígenas dentro do
presence of indigenous
cenário
artists
dos territórios nacionais é muito grande,
on the national territories
muito forte,
is very strong and very
de
present.
beleza, de poesia,
The
mas também
poetry and the
de
beauty of the
presença política.
presence of their work, as well as the political presence.
E, enfim, e conhecendo realidades como o Canadá, os Estados Unidos,
Also knowing
percebi
about the
que a
realities
gente
in
no
the
Brasil
US
está
and Canada, in Brazil,
muito atrás no tempo dessa
I
ocupação
feel that
dos
we're a bit
espaços
backwards in terms of
de arte no Brasil.
the presence of these artists.
Acho que o meu projeto artístico, na verdade, é criar condições para que
My
muitos
artistic
artistas
project is
indígenas
to create the conditions
estejam presentes em instituições de arte no
that
Brasil.
indigenous artists can be
Inclusive,
present
a
in institutions in
discutir
Brazil.
sobre arte contemporânea ou arte
And also have discussions about
indígena de
indigenous
outros
art
modos de pensar aqui no Brasil.
and different modes of
Então,
thinking
meu
about art in
trabalho
Brazil.
enquanto artista, ele é
My work
muito
as an artist
mais
is much more
político
political
do que construção de objetos.
than more so than the construction of
Eu
some
me
kind of object.
considero
I
artista
consider myself
nesse lugar.
an artist in
Então,
this kind of
a maioria dos
activity.
meus trabalhos, eles
Part of my work
envolvem espaços
is
que
focused on
ajudem
creating
a
spaces
ocupar outros
that help
espaços.
occupy other spaces.
Dos projetos que chama Brasil Terra Indígena
Project
é uma série de
of Brazil Indigenous
encontros,
Brazil.
oficinas
It's a series of meetings, workshops,
e
seminars,
exercícios
and
que
exercises
possibilitam, com o ganho dessas oficinas, trazer artistas para o Sudeste.
that allow
Então,
us to bring
muitos
artists to the
artistas
Southeast.
indígenas hoje no Brasil
Many of the
estão
indigenous
ocupando
artists
muitos espaços
are
acabaram
beginning to
por vir ao
occupy
Sudeste a partir desse projeto chamado Brasil Terra Indígena, que
a
gera
lot of
uma
new
série de
spaces through this
cartazes que
project
são
that I'm speaking
vendidos,
about, which is called Brazil
e também uma série de encontros.
Indigenous Land,
Então,
and through various meetings that have
o
been
meu
happening.
trabalho é isso. Em Baniwa,
This is the focus of my work.
Em Baniwa tem uma palavra que
In the
traduz
language
esse
Baniwa,
movimento que eu tento fazer aqui. Chama Itarraquateti,
we have a
que
word,
é
which is the word
todo o
by the
processo
kind of the founders
da
of Baniwa,
condição, né? E
condition of
acho que esse é
allowing
meu
those that
projeto
have
enquanto
lived yet
artista
to be able to
de
live
origem indígena no
in,
Brasil.
in the
Usar a
world.
minha presença e o
Use my
meu
presence as an artist,
status social
my social status
nesse
in this moment,
mundo da arte,
world of the
para
art,
dar condições para
give
outros
conditions for other
artistas
artists to also be able
terem uma presença um pouco mais
to be able to have
saudável
presence and to be able to occupy
Enfim,
spaces.
eu tenho vários projetos que
Have
incluem
different
comunidade,
projects
pessoas,
communities, people,
exercícios de produção
and of course,
textual, produção
production, textual
de
production,
documentos
creation of
que
documents,
criem repertório para quem é indígena, mas também para quem não é
create a
indígena,
repertoire for both
principalmente
those that are
na
indigenous, but also those
academia,
that aren't
né?
indigenous, both in spaces that are academic,
Mas eu escolhi para falar,
and
que
I've
é o meu
chosen one
projeto
to speak about,
atual,
which is
que
my current
está na
project,
Pinacoteca de São Paulo.
which is in the Pinacoteca of São Paulo,
Antes
right?
de começar, eu tenho, enfim, nem todo mundo é do Brasil, só para localizar de onde eu venho.
To locate where I'm
Eu
coming
venho
from,
desse lugar
I'm coming from this
chamado
location, from this place,
Rio Negro,
which is
no
called
Amazonas,
Rio Negro,
na
like the Black River in
fronteira do
Amazon,
Brasil com Colômbia e
on
com
the frontier of
Venezuela.
Brazil with Colombia and Venezuela.
Desse lugar que eu nasci e, enfim,
This is where I was
vivi
born.
por muito tempo,
This is where I
tem
lived for
23 povos
a lot of
indígenas
my life.
e 23 idiomas
There's
falados.
23
O
indigenous
Brasil é o
communities and languages.
primeiro lugar,
Brazil is,
na verdade, é o primeiro lugar e o único lugar até agora que o
Brazil is
governo brasileiro
one of the
reconheceu
only places
3 línguas indígenas
that
como línguas
three
oficiais do
three
Brasil.
indigenous languages have been
Baniwa, idioma Baniwa,
considered
idioma
as
tucano e idioma Nhangatu. Além do português,
local languages
essas são
beyond
as línguas
Portuguese.
oficiais do
These are official languages within Brazil. These
Além
three
do
languages.
português, essas são línguas oficiais
They're
do
also considered
Brasil.
official languages of Brazil beyond
No
Portuguese.
Brasil, são falados mais de 200
In Brazil, there's more than
idiomas indígenas
200 languages that are
e
spoken,
apenas 3
And just 3 of these languages are considered
oficialmente
official
no
languages.
Estado brasileiro.
By the,
Então, documentos oficiais, por exemplo,
so official documents, for
são
example,
nessa região,
in this region
são escritos nessas línguas.
are also written in
português.
languages. In
Em
these
nenhum
beyond
outro
Portuguese.
lugar do Brasil,
In no other part
documentos
of Brazil,
oficiais
documents, official documents are
são
translated
traduzidos em
to
outras
other
línguas.
languages.
Isso é muito importante,
It's very
isso
important.
diz muito sobre essa região.
Not about this region,
Né?
which is very specific.
Enfim, o trabalho que eu quero falar chama
What I want to
Escola
work about,
Panapaná.
speak about, is called
Panapaná é
Panapana School.
em idioma Nhengatu.
Panapana
Em
in the
Baniwa
language of Nhengatu.
seria Macaro,
In Baniwa, it would be Macaro.
que também significa a mesma coisa, que é o coletivo de borboletas.
It means a collective
Esse
of butterflies.
trabalho na Pinacoteca
This
vai
work
ficar
in
até o final
Pinacoteca
de
in
junho
São Paulo
desse
will
ano.
be
Teve
until the end of
início no dia 18
July.
de março.
And began in
E
March.
o que é a Escola Panapaná?
What is the school
No
of
mundo
Panapana?
Baniwa,
In
a casa comum, que
in the
a gente chama
reality,
de
in the Baniwa
toca,
reality,
a
the
casa
house,
comunitária, onde
community
vivem várias
house,
famílias, onde
called an
compartilham o
oka,
espaço,
where multiple
ela é
the community share
dividida
space.
em várias atividades e
It's
vários
divided into
aprendizados
multiple activities,
diariamente.
multiple ways of
A
knowledge.
imagem da esquerda é um corte
You can see on the
aéreo
left
de uma casa comunitária
aerial
baniana.
vision of one of these
Então,
kinds of
tem o
homes.
pátio de dança, onde se
There's a
ensina
patio
danças,
for
as
dance,
histórias, a
for dance stand, where
música.
stories are told
Tem
and where
as
music is played.
fogueiras e as redes, onde se contam as
You can
histórias
also see
da cosmologia baniwa. Enfim, a
where
casa
stories are
comunitária...
told, the Baniwa stories are told
Ok.
amongst people in the community.
A casa comunitária,
The community house
ela é uma grande escola
is
cotidiana
a school, is a
que
daily
não
school,
tem uma grade curricular, não
and it
tem
doesn't
horário fixo
have a
para se
curriculum that's
aprender.
pre-written.
Ela é cotidiana
It's a
e
daily school,
constante.
and it's constant.
Em qualquer momento
So
da
in any
vida
moment of
de
their
uma
life,
pessoa baniwa,
a person, Baniwa,
ela está aprendendo com
person
alguém,
learning,
aprendendo coisas da cultura
learning things about the culture of their own culture,
imaterial,
and
mas também
immaterial
aprendendo a
culture,
caçar,
but also learning how
pescar,
to hunt,
enfim,
how to fish,
coisas da vida prática
things of a practical
do
lifestyle
povo.
of the community.
Do lado direito é o
Right
esquema
side,
do universo a
it's
partir da cultura baniwa.
a vision of the universe from the
No mundo
cosmovision of Baniwa.
baniwa, a gente acredita
We believe
que
in the Baniwa vision,
o nosso universo, esse
that a
que a gente
universe,
está vivendo aqui,
one that
a
we're
gente
living
se
in
vê
now,
e conversa,
and that we're
ele
speaking
é
in now,
dos 22
one of
outros
the
universos
22
que se
universes
confluem,
that are
né?
connected.
Tem muitos filmes que falam sobre multiversos.
There's a lot
Os
of films that
Baniwa
say
falam
about
sobre
multiverses,
multiversos e vivem multiversos
and the
há
Baniwas also have a
9.000
vision of
anos.
multiverses and live within these
E
multi-universes.
cada universo
And each
desse
one of these
que
universes
está confluindo com o nosso universo
is interconnected with
são
this universe,
gerenciados por entidades que também são professores.
and they're also organized and led
Só
by
que, ao
entities
contrário
that are
do
like
mundo que a gente
teachers
vive e
for
da
each of
casa
these
comunitária Baniwa, só quem tem acesso a esses professores de outros mundos
and only those that
são
have
os
access to the
xamãs.
teachers are the
Em
shamans.
Baniwa, a gente
In
chama de
Baniwa,
Mariri,
we
que
speak about
são
them
os
as
pajés
Mare,
Baniwa, os xamãs
but the
Baniwa.
pajes or the shamans
Os
Baniwa, and they
xamãs
have
Baniwa,
access
então,
to these
atravessam esses
entities that we consider
multiversos
professors
e,
and have
quando
access to
voltam
all
à
these
Terra,
other
ensinam
multiverses.
a nós sobre o que
And they
aprendeu
teach
nesses
us
lugares.
about these other
É
these
isso.
other universes or these other.
E a escola Panapaná,
So the school Panapana
ela é instrumento artístico
an artistic
de
instrument
apresentar
to be able to
mundos
share
que se
worlds
confluem.
that are in confluence, that are in connection.
Essa é a estrutura,
So the
que a
structure
princípio a gente chama de um casulo.
that initially
E
we
esse
call
casulo, como bicho da seda, constantemente
which
vai
is where
sendo
butterfly
construído e
is
alimentado
generated,
pelos conteúdos de aprendizado.
and where it's
E os mundos
much
que se
nurtured
construem na escola
by the
Panapaná
knowledge.
é trazido por pessoas indígenas de
And
diversos lugares do Brasil e de
information that's
diversas
taught is brought by different communities,
intelectualidades
different individuals from different
indígenas.
communities, from different parts of Brazil. So they come and teach in these.
Essa é uma programação
This
de
is
março
the
que
programming
teve
for
o
school
André Baniwa,
in
que
March.
falou
And in this
sobre
case, it was Andrea Baniwa
as
who spoke
nas rochas no território Baniwa.
about
A primeira apresentação que tem ali, Ian, Wapixana e a Brisa Flow, foi um show musical
and there was also a musical
de
show
música contemporânea indígena.
of
Nelson D, que é o último
contemporary music, indigenous contemporary music,
frame,
played by Nelson D.
Ele apresentou um experimento musical
He shared
música
a musical
tradicional
experiment
e música
of traditional music
contemporânea.
and contemporary
Esse
music.
frame é um exemplo de uma
This is an
programação
example of one of the
já
programs that happened within the school.
Essa é a grade curricular fixa,
This is the curriculum.
uma parte da grade curricular fixa de coisas que acontecem na escola Panapaná
This is a
desde
curriculum
março.
that's constantly
Então,
happening within
tem
the school.
professores de música,
So there's
artes visuais,
teachers for music,
cultura,
culture,
idiomas.
visual
Temos
arts,
aula
languages.
essa semana tivemos aula de Nhangatu,
We had
mas
Ninga.
teve aulas de idioma Guarani,
We've had languages
idioma
Guarani
Baniwa,
taught, the languages
idioma
Baniwa taught,
tucano e agora
Mana
Nhangatu.
language taught as well. Languages taught.
Enfim, é uma
Multiple
série
languages
de
that been taught.
programações que trazem indígenas
This is a
de
curriculum
diversos
that brings
lugares do
different
Brasil para esse espaço,
individuals,
para
indigenous
compartilhar seus
teachers
conhecimentos.
from different communities to teach their
E
knowledges.
isso, para mim, é muito importante, porque
This for me is very important.
como o cenário artístico indígena
Because
no
the
Brasil
scenario
ele é
in Brazil
contemporâneo, ele é muito recente e pouco
very
entendido
recent. The contemporary
pelo,
indigenous scenario is
pelo
recent.
sistema artístico brasileiro. Muito do que se espera quando há um convite para uma pessoa indígena
A lot of things that are
apresentar uma coisa
waited for
pré-formatada
is that
como
what's
uma
going to be
pintura
presented,
ou uma tela, algo que
that
seja uma
something.
representação do que um artista branco faria.
So what's expected normally is that an artist will share something formatted in terms of an object, in terms of piece of art,
sem compartilhar muito. Então, para mim, é
out of further
importante
sharing of a
trazer
process.
a Escola Panapaná,
So my
que
idea
é
of
dos maiores
school
museus de arte do
Panapaná,
Brasil,
one of the largest
que
museums
esse
in Brazil,
espaço traga outros
to
artistas
bring
para ocuparem.
bring other artists together with myself.
Então, o sistema coletivo
So the collective system,
para mim,
Biennial,
é um sistema que me representa enquanto artista.
for me is something that represents myself as an
Então,
artist.
além da programação fixa que
beyond
nós montamos com alguns
The program and
professores,
the curriculum, the fixed curriculum,
qualquer indígena do Brasil, ou
any
que esteja no
indigenous
Brasil, que não seja do
artist
Brasil,
from Brazil,
mas que esteja no Brasil,
or even not from Brazil,
pode propor uma
Brazil,
atividade
and propose an
uma
activity
aula
or a workshop or a
que
class
seja relacionado
that was
com
somehow
arte
that
ou
is somehow
cultura.
related to
Então, além da programação
culture.
fixa, a gente tem uma série
So
de
beyond the
aulas que
constant
são
curriculum, we also
propostas
have
por indígenas
invitations
que,
and proposals by other artists
se sentem convocados a ocupar o espaço.
who feel invited to come and
Isso
share
tem sido muito interessante.
materials
né?
and this has been really interesting.
Enfim, e aí a gente vai ter uma programação até final de julho.
So we continue with this program until the end of July.
Espero que com esse trabalho a instituição da Pinacoteca reconheça a presença de outros artistas indígenas e esses artistas indígenas se sintam confortável em apresentar propostas para outras instituições de
and that
arte.
indigenous artists will also feel more comfortable and more engaged to present their works in other institutions.
Esse é o meu trabalho enquanto artista.
my work as an
A
artist.
Escola Panapaná, além das programações
Panapaná School,
na instituição da Pinacoteca,
beyond its program within the
forçou
Pinacoteca,
a aproximação da Pinacoteca com umas 3 instituições de arte no Brasil.
I've also been working
2
with 3 other
museus e uma
institutions,
casa de cultura.
2
O Museu da
museums
Língua
and a cultural
Portuguesa,
house.
o Museu das Culturas Indígenas e
The
a
Museum
Casa do
of
Povo, que é
Indigenous
organismo também de arte,
Afro-Indigenous, which is
mais
an organism of art
privado.
that's more private.
Esse é meu trabalho enquanto artista.
So this is my work as an artist, bringing
Muito
together and working
obrigado.
with the school in other cultural centers as well as the Pinoteca.
Hi, everybody. Nice to meet you. I hope you can hear me okay. And thank you very
Espero
much
que vocês
for...
consigam me ouvir. Muito obrigado.
I will try to keep this short and then a kind of
Vou
general...
tentar.
You're welcome to ask me questions afterwards.
Vocês são
conversation.
bem-vindos a me fazer perguntas.
So I belong to the Sami people, the
Eu
indigenous people.
pertenço ao pessoal indígena Sami.
And I come originally from a reindeer herding family.
Eu venho originalmente de uma família de pastores.
And but I'm educated as an artist. I have an MA in contemporary art from the Tromsø Academy of Contemporary Art.
Ele tem mestrado em arte contemporânea de Tromsø.
And I work with I'm a multidisciplinary artist.
Eu sou artista multidisciplinar.
I have background in photography, but I work these days mainly with video art, especially.
Eu tenho experiência em fotografia, mas especialmente agora com vídeo arte.
Especially with multi-channel video installations, combining that with other stuff.
Ok, ele trabalha com múltiplos canais de vídeo simultaneamente.
But also sometimes with sound art, with sculptural installations and so on.
Também trabalha com arte sonora e instalações multimídia, esculturas em vídeo.
And maybe my main question or topic that I'm working with at the moment is
talvez o assunto que eu esteja trabalhando agora
is this kind of like indigenous relationship with nature contra modern society's relationship with nature, and the question of why these two seem to be constantly conflicting. And what does this conflict mean?
O assunto que ele está trabalhando agora é o conflito que existe entre as comunidades locais e a natureza com os modelos da sociedade maior.
And why? What does it mean? What does it? Why is this way of understanding or relating with the nature so fundamentally different that this sort of don't seem to be able to coexist, at least on indigenous land? And this is why our people, as many other indigenous peoples all around the world, seem to be constantly struggling with this problem. I come from a village and from a family who also has a long history with conflicting with the nation state and its industrial development expanding on our lands. My home village, which is Vuotso in northern Finland, we have for almost 100 years we've been struggling against the forest industry, the Finnish forest industry, which maybe increased in the post-Second World War era from 1950s on. And so I'm just explaining this because this is some kind of, this is part of my background that affects my artistic practice quite a lot.
Eu só explico isso porque, na verdade, é o que influencia fundamentalmente na minha visão da arte que eu produzo.
And also in my village, we have been experiencing the effects of hydropower construction. We have the largest artificial lake water reservoir in Northern Europe, which is built on our reindeer herding village land. This water reservoir is part of network of hydropower plants that were constructed along a river that used to be the most productive salmon river in Europe before the Second World War. And the lake I mentioned earlier, this one, which is the biggest in Northern Europe, it's called Lokka. It also, when it was constructed at the turn of 1960s, 1970s, it also covered the single largest peatland in Europe. But I don't, as an artist, I don't just want to tell, I don't just want to sort of be mediator of political struggles and indigenous people's struggles, but I try to work in a way that I can like somehow offer the audience a possibility to shift perspective on their relationship with nature. And I also work with other topics, which I can very shortly try to explain. Things like the cultural appropriation of Sami culture, for example, in Finnish tourism industry, and how that has affected also our political struggles, how this cultural appropriation is not just cultural appropriation, but it has it always has this political side to it. And I also work with topics like, which seems to be global phenomena, at least it sort of has been a little bit researched both in Europe and in Canada and North America. In North America, it's called the pretendians. We don't have such a word for it here, but we talk about people who are faking their indigenous identity, and how this is also posing another kind of threat for the Sami culture at the moment. And I have a new work, this topic of relationship with nature, indigenous relationship with nature, and it conflicting with modern society's relationship with nature. It's a long, ongoing, slow process, and I have a new work that is a new chapter on that, which will be presented at the Helsinki Biennale that opens next week.
I have some points that make some dialogues between your all practices. I just give some like an inputs like these, and then you can maybe say something more. Because when I think about Matti's work, for example, he mentioned about your archive, your family archive. This work on the archive of your grandfather that you showed in this exhibition in Helsinki, that I found was is dialogue with Moara. Moara has a museum, which is a museum made on her family story. As these memories, the memories, the family memories works in your, and personal trajectory works in your like common points between the practices of both of you. As for example, even the Nilsson and Matti, you have something very common about your kind of research. To research on the intersection between the histories of indigenous resistance in the United States and Nordic countries. While the Nilsson had a residency also at Getty Institute last year, if I'm not wrong, and he was doing something very similar between First Nation people from the US and indigenous people in Brazil. It's like this curatorial practice, like Maria, she presented the curatorial practice developed as a semi-perspective, like how did you develop a safe space for practitioner, which is exactly what the Nilsson is trying to do in the space of the school, for example, and that is something that he often comments about. What the main goal, the role of like take this responsibility in relation with the relatives. Yeah, and which is also something that is resonate in Onkar work as a curator of a space that he said at the beginning is a space that is a no space, and so how you have that are you sure that the kind of attention and the caring which needs to be embedded in the curatorial work.
Afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for your presentations. They've really just been eye-opening. So,
Obrigado.
Obrigada a todos. So the question is that, of course, you know, as we try to deal with very complex politics around how we relate to issues of land and to the various people who represent indigeneity. And then, of course, the practice that our practice as artists, as curators, means that we're working in spaces that are either owned by, you know, those who are wealthy, those who are outside of those, and I'm using the word communities very sensitively. So the question is, what have your experiences been on the predicaments of our practice and of exhibition, and especially as they arise when indigeneity is again on display or on exhibition?
So the questions of the challenges in institutional spaces?
Eurocêntricos, brancos, é isso?
In Eurocentric spaces, and my largest dream is to decentralize the exhibitions that happen in the southeast of Brazil to other places.
Amazônia, para Belém,
as well, go to
capitais.
Belém as well, to the north of Brazil.
Mas é uma oportunidade também para os
It's an
artistas
opportunity for the artists
conseguirem ter visibilidade quando vão para São Paulo,
in São Paulo,
que é um grande lugar
because it's an important place
tem a visibilidade
where there's visibility
econômica,
for artists
da
and economic
criatividade,
visibility
enfim.
and for creativity.
Para mim, um grande desafio também na construção da exposição, da
Another
curadoria,
challenge with
foi tentar fazer com que escutassem a gente.
to have them really listen to us,
Eu acho que, assim, chamam curadores da Amazônia,
because we're
chamam
called curators
curadores
of the Amazon,
indígenas,
or the indigenous
chamam
curators,
facilitadores
or
indígenas.
facilitators of
Parece que, às
indigenous.
vezes,
Seems
só para
sometimes
cumprir tabela.
it's just kind of to
Mas escutar,
correspond to a
co-criar junto,
politeness.
sempre parece ser um problema, um desafio, porque, de alguma forma, nos colocam, mais uma vez, no lugar incapazes.
But it happens that we're placed in this position of incapacity.
Dá até gatilho. Tá ouvindo?
So the question of how we're treated and how we're respected as curators. So not being
projetar,
institutions sometimes don't trust in us,
não acreditar
or
na nossa
don't believe in our capacity
possibilidade de inovação.
of innovation and capacity of
Isso,
innovation.
para mim, é um gatilho muito grande.
A challenge.
Os profissionais do sudeste do Brasil, principalmente
professionals from the southeast of Brazil,
acham sempre que são superiores.
They consider
Eles
them
querem fazer tudo,
superior.
querem ter a visão
They want to do
deles.
everything. They want to have the
Isso
vision
é muito
of their own vision,
problemático. Então,
and it's problematic because they don't create space for us.
é sempre uma luta, toda
So it's always
vez
a challenge
quando a gente vai fazer uma curadoria com
for
uma
doing
instituição.
curatorship with an
São
institution.
poucos que conseguem nos escutar,
Few institutions that are able to really
negociar.
listen to us and
Então,
negotiate with us.
é muita energia, tem que estar
A
com
lot
o
of
corpo
energy.
muito preparado
You have to have your body very
toda
prepared,
vez, né?
your presence
Tomar uns
prepared.
banhos toda
Take,
vez,
take
porque eu acho que sempre muito pesado trabalhar com
some
curadoria
protection for yourself
no
to be able
Brasil.
to work with
Né? Isso é
curators
a
in
última
Brazil.
experiência que eu tive, né?
This
Tanto
is
que
my
agora eu estou
last
mais
experiences.
na questão autônoma e artes. Estou mais me projetando quanto artista,
Because I've also been working
mas
as
não
artist,
deixando
so
também de lutar nesse cenário
not,
de curador que
but also wanting to continue to work
ainda às vezes a gente precisa
space of
estar
curatorship because
também
it's
para
important for us to be
facilitar,
there.
para conseguir com que os nossos também consigam
Be able to facilitate
acessar locais nunca
and give access to the artists.
Conseguiram entrar de fato, né? Então, nessa última eu tive essa experiência. Também do tempo. O tempo de fazer,
as well as the time.
Se ia dar tempo, o tempo de montagem, de mostração, o tempo de mostrar uma expografia e achar que a gente não ia dar conta.
Too little amount of time to show the materials, to prepare the materials.
O tempo foi um grande desafio.
Time was always a large
o tempo do Sudeste, de São Paulo, é muito rápido.
Nosso
tempo ele não é tão rápido, é um tempo do cuidado.
Our time is different. Your notion of time is different. Our experience of time.
Quando se fala em arte contemporânea no Brasil,
when we're speaking about contemporary art in Brazil, and curatorship
10 vezes mais complexo.
Is 10,000 times more complicated.
Toda uma cultura construída nos processos.
Because of a culture
É difícil acompanhar. Eu tô agora fazendo uma co-curadoria no museu em Paris para 2025. Essa curadoria está sendo construída desde 2020. É um tempo bastante longo para pensar sobre uma curadoria em uma instituição. E eu tenho visto outras experiências fora do Brasil que o tempo da construção das coisas é muito mais largo que aqui no Brasil. No Brasil, as curadorias que eu tive participação eram curadorias que tinham 3 meses para ser construído tudo.
Just in 3 months to do
2
everything.
meses.
Or 2 months to do everything.
Em qualquer lugar do mundo isso é impossível.
Any other part of the world, this is
fazer uma coisa
impossible.
em 3
Do
meses.
something in 3 months.
A gente no Brasil tem uma estrutura
In Brazil, we have a
nas
structure
instituições
institutions.
que é insalubre.
That's
Fora isso, a instituição colonial, que são as instituições de arte
colonial
no Brasil,
institution, which
elas
is
são muito
art in Brazil.
duras e
They're also
muito
very strict,
complicadas de se
hard, and
negociar.
complicated to have
As
negotiations.
experiências que eu tive em
So the experiences I've had
instituições no Rio de Janeiro e em São Paulo
with institutions in Rio and in Rio de Janeiro and São
super
Paulo,
exaustivas,
it was very exhaustive.
porque parece que há uma necessidade inicial
Seems like there's a
de
necessity
se
from the beginning
educar
to educate
curadores,
curator
críticos
and critics of
e
art,
inclusive artistas
and even
não
artists,
indígenas,
even
para
non-indigenous
entender
artists.
um processo de construção diferente da que é estabelecida, né? Há uma necessidade de educar ainda a instituição para entender corpos diferentes
The
que vão
institution had a
ocupar
hard
o
time to
espaço.
understand
E
other
aí
regions,
desde o diretor da
the
instituição,
cultures. And so it's the work
da
of
equipe de trabalho,
the director
até
of
a
the
equipe de
institution,
apoio
and even
mais
the
básica,
supporting
que
institution
nunca foram preparados,
that aren't
nunca
well prepared
esperaram presença de artistas indígenas e
to
negros,
deal
por
with
exemplo,
and to
nas
exchange with
instituições.
indigenous artists. The
Minha
institutions aren't
última
well prepared
experiência
in my life.
com uma instituição de arte foi terrível, assim,
My last experience was
porque
horrible.
primeiro que parece que o Brasil, pressionado por um mundo em mudança fora daqui, né, com presença indígena nas bienais grandes, em outras instituições fora do Brasil. O Brasil ficou, como eu disse na minha fala anterior, está muito, muito atrás. Estamos no mínimo 35 anos atrás do resto do mundo, em questão de discussão sobre arte indígena ou arte decolonial, como falam. E aí as instituições do Brasil querendo atravessar esse tempo perdido, parece que inserem pessoas indígenas ou pessoas negras em suas instituições,
but haven't done the work to prepare the people and directors working in the institution.
E isso está super complicado no Brasil ainda.
And this is very
O que
complicated.
tem mudado, o que facilita a nossa vida
What
no
makes it
Brasil,
easier for us to work in
é que
Brazil?
há uma renovação
That there's a
no
kind of an
corpo
innovation and
de
a new
curadores
presence of
de arte no
curators
Brasil.
of artists in Brazil. So there's
Curadores
new
que já
artists, new curators,
são muito antigos, pouco pensam em mudar a
Normally, those that
situação
are older
de
curators
curadoria de arte no
have a hard
Brasil.
time thinking
Mas
about
curadores
shifting the way
novos,
curatorship is done.
vindos inclusive de políticas públicas de ensino público no Brasil, curadores com 25, 30, 35, 40 anos, são muito novos no Brasil.
And then there are
Isso
curators
são,
that are younger,
são
that are
corpos novos
25,
que
30, 35,
curadoria no
40.
Brasil também. Então, tem muitos curadores nessa faixa etária que são de origem negra,
And a lot
são
of
de
these younger
origem
curators
não
are coming
binária,
from
são de gêneros não binários, são
Afro-Indigenous
mulheres.
origins, are women. So it's
Isso
a
é
new
muito novo no
innovation of
Brasil.
curators.
A
This new
maioria
kind of
era...
approach to
Desculpa me
curatorship in
interromper.
Brazil.
A maioria
I'm getting
no
excited.
Brasil era de homens brancos,
Before this,
velhos,
curators were
descendentes
mostly
das classes mais altas.
white
Porque
men
no
that
Brasil
were coming from
quem
an economic
diz
situation
o
of
que é
privilege.
arte ou o que não é, ou quem estabelece as regras da arte no Brasil,
What
ainda são
creates
pessoas
the rules
velhas que
of
nem
art in Brazil are normally
sempre
people that are older,
de
coming from an
cabeças
older
escravagistas.
generation, from a place of privilege, and from
Então, ser curador no Brasil,
a vision,
vindo de uma origem
colonial vision of
à
Brazil.
margem ou na fronteira, é bem negro,
Whichever
não
curator
binário,
that is
mulher,
coming from an indigenous
hoje há
or
de se lidar com
Afro
umas
approach in
instituições
curatorship,
super fechadas,
normally
não
have to do
inclusivas,
dealing with institutions
e
that
há
are
de se
very
lidar
close-minded
com todo
and
um
are
aspecto
having to deal with the whole
de
aspect,
poder da arte
power of
construída
the construction of power
para
with
não serem ocupadas por nós. Então, a gente está no
there's a whole
início da construção das
construction
coisas no Brasil.
power within art that
E,
makes
de
it difficult
fato,
for artists
a
that are coming from a
gente,
marginal space to
claro, não
occupy this
vamos
space.
desistir, mas é muito exaustivo,
So it's very
porque
exhausting.
ainda estamos na fase
We're still in the phase
de educar
to educate
essas pessoas e essas
people
instituições
and these
para
institutions
receberem corpos
how to receive other kinds of bodies, other
diferentes.
vision, other ways of working
Isso.
with art, other processes.
Challenge from our side of communication of the artworks. So there is a huge difference of presenting or making an exhibition in Karasjok, in Sapmi, and communication in various international events. Because in the international events, there is an impression that first layer is a lot of explanations, a lot of pedagogical content about the location and the history of Sapmi before coming into the content of artworks and art. So we notice huge difference in the way we communicate.
I suppose from my perspective is when you're asked to work on a biennial is to really spend critical time on thinking what a biennial is and what it does. And to do that, I think you have to go beyond the kind of first layer of how a public, yes, so you just don't reproduce some of those contradictions and bad practices that are kind of embedded in the biennial format.
I wanted to say, Nomusa, thank you for your very interesting question. I won't keep you guys here, but I mean that's a good and interesting question. Position of an indigenous artist is always a bit complex, and sometimes it's almost like a label. Like as an artist, you wonder sometimes it's like you are an indigenous and you're an artist, but sometimes you put into this kind of like a category of being an indigenous artist. That's also can be problematic. But I think we don't have time to continue too deep into that.
I wish there was a chance to ask you about the pretense of indigeneity that you raised, but again, we open another can of worms, as we're saying.
If you can probably have my contacts from Laura, and Laura can put you in touch with me, so you can contact me and we can continue the discussion also with all of you.
Yeah.
Okay. Perfect.
Yeah.
Tá dando para escutar?
Sim, um minuto e meio, porque aqui falta a luz e vamos ficar fora da sala mesmo.
Ok. A minha atuação como artista e curadora, ela é longa pra caramba, mas ao mesmo tempo eu vejo um frescor muito grande hoje, né? Para quem começou a atuar em 1980, quem vê hoje o nosso universo aqui no Brasil é bonito, é interessante, mas é preocupante, né? Porque o que mais temos que enfrentar para que a gente seja visto e que a gente seja ouvido?
So the question is, how can we be seen but
Parece
also
que a
heard?
gente tem que matar um boi por dia, que nem a PL que está
There's a lot of
votando,
challenges that come up
né?
during the
Então, no
process.
momento você acha que está bem, outra
So you
hora
think
não
everything's
tá.
okay, but
Então,
at the
é como
same
se
time,
fosse
then
um
at the next
pisca-pisca
moment,
de
it's not
carro,
okay.
sabe?
There's lots of
Uma hora
issues
tá, uma hora
here.
não tá, uma hora tá, uma hora não tá. Hoje, eu, Denilson,
Today,
Dayara,
myself, Dayara, Danielson,
Naine Terena, a gente tem
different artists,
a gente tem um público que
we
nos
have
ouve e que
we
nos
have a
vê,
public that
né?
listens to us.
Mas até quando?
But the question is,
Pra isso?
when will
Porque
this
parece
last
que todos
until?
os dias a gente tem que provar que a gente
Because each day it's like we have to
capaz que a
prove
gente pode.
that we can have the space that we have.
Deixa o segundo.
She sees through like a large perspective. She's been doing this. She's been an artisan and actor for a long time. She sees there's a new fresh air of a lot of new faces coming in, and she sees a positive attitude towards the whole process of gain visibility. Indian issues gaining visibility in Brazil as never before. But also she sees as a waves of coming in and out, as a struggle with the government about, for example, land demarcation. Right now it's happening. So it's a constant struggle. That she's saying that it's a fight that keeps in and out for a long time. But she sees with the positive attitude right now, because there's a lot of new faces. But that's what she keeps emphasizing about the very importance of being listened and being heard, and be that indigenous agendas get through and through more and more. So she doesn't lose hope, and she's acknowledged there's a beautiful work going on. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thanks a lot, and we see you soon again. Thank you. Bye. Bye. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thanks
Bye.
for the time.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye. Bye.